Hi, and welcome to Substack Week in Review, Unscripted number 7 podcast for Pegasus Research. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Today is May the 4th, 2024, so happy day for all Star Wars fans out there. Okay, this week we're going to talk about 3 of my papers I wrote this week on Substack. Thank you for all that went out and read my work this week. So the first article this week was the 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium. The other was the Macron Gambit. And finally, an eventful week between China and the Philippines. It seems like a common occurrence now. So, first is the 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium. Just like the last article about the conflict between the Philippines and China, this one also involves China and other naval powers. The 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium is a symposium that takes place every other year. This year was in Qingdao, China, a port city, which is the first time China has hosted it in 10 years. The theme, which was kind of funny, was Oceans with a Shared Future, which turns out to be very ironic, but we'll get into that shortly. It happened on April 21st through the 24th of 2024. There was 180 delegates from 29 navies or maritime defense agencies, coast guards, such like that, including the U.S., China, Australia, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, India, France, and Russia, as well as navies from the Americas and Western Asia. I think actually Mexico had their representative. Not sure if it was their Navy or their Coast Guard. So notable attendees was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and Admiral Stephen Kohler and the U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns. And the keynote speaker and the Chinese host was from the Central Military Commission, Vice Chairman General Zhang Yuxia, who gave the keynote address, which we'll be much talking about in this paper. The intent of the meeting is again, it happens every other year. It's a forum discussions that's based around maritime issues in the Western Pacific and areas of cooperation such as disaster relief and military-to-military communications. The accomplishments of this one, it actually did have some accomplishments, was update the standing code for unplanned encounters at sea and disaster response guidelines. The interesting thing is we talk more and more about drones and warfare. The attendees also agreed to create a working group, which I think will meet next year, to study the impact of unmanned systems and determine if additional guidance is needed for future symposium guidelines and rules in these. And then there's also some of the accomplishments of the meeting was the bilateral meetings and trilateral meetings with peers in the region. So admirals met with other admirals. Though I don't know if Admiral Kohler met with General Yuxia. I had not read anything specific about that. My angle that this was, again, this first part of the meeting that we just talked about above, some of the accomplishments, some of the goals, that's the feel-good part of the meeting. And but the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the People's Liberation Army Navy leadership and the CMC, the Central Military Commission, saw this as an opportunity to make their position clear to a gathered audience, which I felt like these guys couldn't leave. I mean, they weren't prisoners, but they were basically figuratively captured in China. They had to sit down and listen to some of these opinions. I don't want to say threats, but it was not. Well, actually, I guess it was threats. What China's going to do and what China expects from the members of the symposium, not something that you would expect the host of this summit to do. China does have a lot of disputes across the Pacific, and I guess they had a lot of time to unload on this stuff. So the idea is that a lot of the disputes across the Pacific, which is that we're talking about a shared future as the theme of it, is the only shared futures is if everybody shares the unanimous assent to Chinese determinism wherever they determine that they have the need to take over South China Sea, rivers in North China, fisheries all around South America. Just whatever China wants, China gets, and if you don't assent unanimously, you're the one with the problem. So they took this meeting as an opportunity to unload on those problems, in my point of view. So there's a lot of current issues, and we'll go through. I've obviously written about them quite a bit. Current issues: Taiwan, basically the forced reunification of Taiwan, and threats to invade it, and threats to anybody that interferes, saying it's an internal affair. Claims over the 9-dash line that claims the entire South China Sea, which is also rejected by international courts of the UN, but China ignores the UN in this case, or the International Court. And this issue, the claiming of the South China Sea causes issues with Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan. Japan has another issue outside of South China Sea in the Senkaku and the East China Sea, Senkaku Islands, excuse me, and the East China Sea. South Korea has issues with China in the Yellow Sea, and also that the practice of freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, where the typical traditional military naval powers view naval powers keeping the supply lines, the trade routes open. That's something the U.S., Australia, France, lesser extent Canada. Canada believes in it. It's just they don't have a lot of capacity in this regards. Is that even though U.S., Australia, France, and UK, Canada don't have claims in the South China Sea, they do dispute China, so they go through freedom of navigation exercises and basically traverse around and close to these island chains that China claims as their own, just to show forces like, well, no, we're going to sail through it and we're not going to ask your permission. This is a sore point for China. And they brought it up during these meetings. So, and other meetings as well. So with the backdrop of so many claims in the region, and the General Yuksha basically figuratively holding the microphone since he was chairing the summit, he took the stage and delivered what was the keynote address to the symposium. He had the typical feel-good opening remarks about China being an active participant in international security, such as the anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden off of Somalia. And that is true. They have been a participant in that. They know that the issues in the Gulf of Aden and Somalia pirates is a threat to their shipping, not only of their own ships, but shipping routes coming to and from China to either drop off or pick up goods. So that's important to China, and they do take that role seriously. And then it goes downhill from there. So Zhang Yuksha goes in there and starts talking to generals, basically starts admonishing them that they need to abandon their Cold War mentality, that's what he called it, and avoid a bipolar or multipolar world. This is funny because China's aligned closely with Russia. We see that consistently, where they're consistently back to each other. They're founding members of BRICS. China will not criticize Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, and is helping, apparently helping them get around sanctions. But Russia has talked about it's a bipolar, multipolar world, and that's just the way the world works. Publicly, China rejects that. So kind of odd that they're starting off as rejecting it, but that's more words than any actual action, because what China wants to do is prevent any alliances forming against it. It'd rather divide and conquer. So it'd rather have, if an issue in the South China Sea comes up over claims in the South China Sea with, let's say, Vietnam, China only wants to meet with Vietnam. They don't want to meet with Brunei and Vietnam at the same time, who also have same issues in the South China Sea over disputes of ownership of the South China Sea. China does not want that. Everything has to be negotiated directly in what they call friendly consultations with China, with no third parties or foreign elements. A third party would be, for example, the way I understand it, is if Brunei had an issue, and they brought Vietnam in with it. Vietnam is a member in that South China Sea area. Vietnam would be considered the third party. A foreign element would be the United States. So if the issues with the Philippines, the United States is involved in it because of the defense treaty, the U.S. is considered that foreign element. So he's basically saying that no, only means is friendly consultations one-on-one with China. Well, this is to China's advantage. By far, you can go take out Japan, take out the United States. The China is much bigger than the rest of the countries there. They are bigger economically and militarily, and any non-peer country is not going to be able to stand against it. So that's an advantage of China. If they get into a room with Brunei and Brunei has no backup, Brunei is going to come out on the short end of the stick because China will use the weight of its economic and military strength to bully countries like these smaller countries in the region. Then China says that on top of that, so they say, okay, we don't want alliances, but that's a case where they don't like alliances formed against it, but they will use alliances. Again, we talk about BRICS. But China does have alliances through the UN Security Council. China and Russia are basically aligned in the UN Security Council. Oftentimes, if one uses their veto, the other one will not use their veto. But other than that, so because there's no reason for them to go on record vetoing if Russia's already veto or vice versa. So they don't really act in like giving double vetoes that often, but they do act in accordance with the same interests. So they're very much aligned in the UN Security Council. As I said, they're founding members of BRICS, where they're trying to displace the US dollar as the reserve currency and create a new economic and financial order mainly of developing countries, in which China is considered a developing country. So alliances are good when it serves China's purposes, and they need to be abandoned when they don't serve China's purposes. So the other issue that goes in there is goes into this. I just talked briefly about this, was no foreign elements. This is the example of disputes in the Western Pacific. Foreign elements would be pacts between the U.S. and Philippines, the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and South Korea, AUKUS, and its possible expansion of including Japan. Possibly, I read a report about South Korea. Those are those foreign elements that when the U.S. or Australia, UK, France are all entering into agreements with countries in the South China Sea that have disputes with China, those are the foreign elements. So I brought that up earlier. So again, they're just talking very much about foreign elements. So this is where the threats go. So they basically said the feel-good part, saying that people need to give up their short-sighted view of using alliances, though they're using alliances of their own. And now General Zhang starts threatening. He says, China will safeguard its legitimate rights over what it views as deliberate violations of its sovereignty. That means anybody that's, again, they claim the whole South China Sea. If anybody violates that, for example, the Philippines in the Second Thomas Shoal or the Scarborough Shoal, the U.S. doing their doing freedom of navigation exercises, the Vietnam trying to fish in its particular areas of the South China Sea. Now, China ruthlessly uses their Coast Guard all around the South China Sea. And so they're going around the 9-dash line or sets of rocks and shoals. Well, the Chinese Coast Guard and the maritime militia heavily patrol in those areas. So they're always there, and that's where they're talking about they will come up and they will safeguard, like here's the quote, safeguard its legitimate rights and deliberate violations of its sovereignty. The maritime militia and its gray zone tactics and the Chinese Coast Guard are the ones that enforce this. And they maintain a near constant presence all throughout the South China Sea. So China said it would exercise firm countermeasures against what it views as unreasonable provocation. So, again, violations of the sovereignty and then firm countermeasures when it thinks that their violations to sovereignty are unreasonable provocations. This means that China believes that any counterclaim by any country in the region is illegitimate, and if it wishes to negotiate with China, it must halt all its activities in disputed areas if it wishes to negotiate. Otherwise, that country can be subjected to retaliation by China, but China insists they have the legitimate claim and are not required to halt any of their activities in disputed areas. So, if you have a dispute with China, if you want to negotiate, you have to stop those activities. If you're China, you can continue to occupy as before because their belief is they are right in all matters regarding how they view the South China Sea. So again, there's no real compromise. There's no real way of, there's no way willing to work through the issues of the country. It's basically you have to accept what China says, and if not, you could be subjected to their whims and possible retaliation for violations of their sovereignty, which most of the Western world, or actually most of the world, rejects. So, think that this was bad enough. It continues that Zhang continued to say that China will, quote, resolutely safeguard national unity and interests. Well, this is in regard to reuniting with Taiwan by force if necessary. The unification of Taiwan is an internal matter to the Chinese Communist Party, and basically nobody's allowed that where they talked about, well, they will be willing to negotiate with Brunei or Vietnam 101 about South China Sea issues. The Taiwan question is completely internal and is non-negotiable in the Chinese eyes to anybody. Anybody that doesn't accept that is an act of provocation against China and its sovereignty. So basically, he went in there in front of this whole symposium of naval powers and basically threatened them that that Taiwan is an internal matter that they have no right to intervene in or even discuss. They just have to accept what China says with reunification of Taiwan. And that's another thing, reunification with Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party has never been in charge of Taiwan. Prior to the World War II, it was occupied by Japan, and it was occupied before the communist movement. So Taiwan has never been a location for the Chinese Communist Party to reunify because they were never there. I know you can go to the Chinese diasporas there. The Kuomintang was ejected from mainland China and fled to save itself and set up a country in Taiwan. I guess you could get into some of those discussions, but when they go in there and they just resolutely say they have to reunify, it's like there's nothing to reunify. You never had it, Chinese Communist Party. But if they view Taiwan as their own, which they've never owned Taiwan, where did they stop from here? But anyway, that's a whole different subject. Hopefully we'll never come to that. But the threats of invasion with Taiwan, and again, just a blatant threat to any country. That audience right there was for the naval powers in the region. Basically tell them, butt out. So the purpose of the symposium is for the leaders of the regional nations to discuss initiatives for cooperation and regional and maritime issues with each other. The speech that Zhang Yuxia gave was improper format for the conference, and it was disrespectful to lecture all these guests, these ambassadors, high-ranking naval officers, and treating them more like a captive audience and not respected guests. It's just absolutely rude that you would treat guests to your country, you invite them there as part of the symposium, and then you treat them like this. So the issues that Zhang brought up, when you talk about the South China Sea issue, you talk about the Taiwan issue and the other disputes that China claims in the region, the Western Pacific. These are at the core of political disputes and are not issues to be discussed, or are items to be discussed at the political level and not the military level. Now, the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army and the Central Military Commission, these are part of a communist system. And the lines are blurred between the political and military issues, as the military is an integral part of the communist system. So it's hard to separate when does politics end and when does military begin in a communist system. That's why you look at the Politburo, you have so many military officers, or their other meetings, is that oftentimes the meetings, the Congress, all that, you have a lot of military officers, because the military serves a dual role in societies, in a communist society. And when you talk about the United States Army, belongs to not a political party, it belongs to the country. In China, the People's Liberation Army belongs to the Chinese Communist Party. It serves the party. It does not serve the Chinese nation. Now, you can go in there and try to separate out the two, but there's a difference between the nation and the party. And the PLA serves the party. So, again, they could sit there and argue that, okay, well, we don't delineate between politics and military matters when we discuss this. So these issues that they brought up are political, not military matters. But China knows that most of the countries do not operate in a communist system. And most leaders in countries in the Pacific, or that were in attendance, are subject to the non-military leadership, and they set their policies to serve at the discretion of the political leadership in a Clausewitz-like model. So this just an example of China just being just short-sighted, and just another demonstration of China acting not as a responsible actor. They want to be a superpower, but they can't even control themselves when they have the public stage. And so they're on this world stage hosting this 19th symposium, and they act like a petulant child, and they just go, I think I called them a ham-handed way in foreign relations. It was just absolutely ridiculous the way that China's leadership, in quotes, treats other nations. Like, everything is subservient to China, and everything else is second class to China. It was just absolute ridiculous, and it's just hard to see that how will things eventually get better if you can't negotiate with the way China acts out on everything. Again, South China Sea, Senkaku Islands, Yellow Sea, fisheries, again, talking about damming of the rivers in southern China and taking away water that runs down to South Asia. So it's just ridiculous that this is the world that we have to deal with just no self-awareness at all. So maybe things will change. I just thought it was just a bad example of how a symposium that was supposed to be feel-good occurred. Okay, so now let's go to the other side of the world, the Macron Gambit. Get some interesting history going all the way back to Cold War eras here. So, French President Emmanuel Macron, in recent months, has become much more aggressive in taking a public stance regarding the Russian-Ukraine war. Not sure what his motive is on this. When he talked about deploying NATO troops to Ukraine, he still talks about that. Wants to have open debate. He's getting a little bit of traction on it. Not sure if this is something he truly believes in, or is this a way to try to hardball into some type of negotiated settlement to end the war. Not sure, but he's been very much on the world stage, which has been very different than he had been in the past, the first couple of years of the war. It's in its third year now. Though France has always been a supporter of Ukraine, so don't get me wrong that France has been aloof to Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And it has provided assistance against the Russian invasion. But it is absent on the world stage when you compare it to how the public voices of the U.S., the United Kingdom, Germany, the Baltic countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, Sweden. France has basically been a muted voice when it comes to policy within the Ukraine war, and has left it up to other countries to drive it, which is unusual because France is a nuclear power, and they are a powerful military, and they have taken a very much hands-off approach to policy in Ukraine. I know they had issues where they're dealing in Africa and some others, so maybe they were motivated or focused elsewhere. But that's more me grasping for straws than to say that this is the real reason that France was not involved in the first 2 years of the war in any significant way. And so the one thing that does appear the case is when coming out with these proposals this week, not about the idea of NATO troops going to Europe, it's the idea that Macron has always been a supporter of European unity, and when I talk about European Union unity, and this has always been something that the French, I say always, something the French have been pursuing for quite a few decades in different variations, but they've been pushing for European unity, and I think the war and some other factors, U.S. election, Brexit, I think Macron thinks this is an opportunity for is not to do this for the sake of Europe, but as a chance for France to become the dominant, influencing power in the European Union. So this is a time there's focus on the Ukraine war, focus on the U.S. election, focus on Brexit or the impact of Brexit. All of a sudden, China or France finds itself, and then Macron is also one of the senior leaders in when you compare it to the normal comparison between Germany and France, where it's always been the prior Chancellor Angela Merkel was a long time serving chancellor, and so France was always a junior partner. Now Macron is the senior partner in the German French relationship, and the Germans are very much focused on what is going on in Central and Eastern Europe, much more to an extent than France is. So I think it appears that this is a play by Macron to put France to become the dominant power in the European Union. Not Europe, not in NATO, the European Union. So what we look here is that this is not saying, when I talk about becoming the predominant power in the European Union, and we'll talk about a little bit more about what the military aspects of what Macron is making, is he's not talking about European Union countries leaving NATO, but he's talking about creating something called the EU military. Basically create an EU army that right now when you look at the NATO, when you look at Europe, it's I think basically it's 30 militaries that make up NATO. So there's 30, even though there's one NATO and there's most of these countries in the European Union are NATO members, is it's not one European Union army representing NATO. It's 30 armies that make up NATO that are also members of the European Union. So obviously that means there's 30 general staffs, there's 30 procurement ways. I know there's some cooperation between the countries, but NATO doesn't set any of the standards of weapons or procurement. NATO sets standards. They don't set how things are to be produced. So there's a lot of efficiency in the European model that they have to put a lot of their fixed, as a percent of fixed costs. Probably the European Union has more fixed costs in their military procurement process than, let's say, the United States does. So what Macron is looking at when he talks about the European Army and this proposal he has, I'll discuss here shortly, is the idea is the European Union has a bigger economy than the United States and China. but it doesn't speak as a sole voice. It's just an organization of states. It doesn't have one unity. So the European Union is a superpower, and they do coordinate fairly well as a economic powerhouse, superpower, but they don't have military power to back up their basically their economic superpower, like China does or like U.S. does. Even to a somewhat lesser extent, Japan does. The European Union doesn't have this. So they have, when you look at the European Union, great economic weight and no military, corresponding military capabilities to back up anything that the European Union wants to enforce or enact. And that matters on the world stage, is that if you do not have the power to be able to project power to both protect your economic interests and also, if you have to, enforce sanctions in aspiration of either your economic goals or something to subvert economic goals of another country. Sanctions against Russia, for example. So it seems like he's proposing the idea of the EU army and a new structure that will make the EU's military stature commensurate with its economic superpower status. So this is something that's been advocated by France, even prior to Macron, and was once embraced by the previous German governments. But the Ukraine war has kind of changed some of the priorities on that. Not saying the German government is opposed to it, but they're not on board like they used to be. And this was something that was vehemently opposed by the UK. No way, no how they were ever going to agree to this. And again, unanimous consent in the EU. So UK is out of Brexit. They're gone. So that's one block is cleared, and France is now the senior partner in the German-French axis in the European Union. So this makes it really the right time to press for this proposal. So one of the things that we go into, some of the things is that they go into that this makes the right time is the French are suspicious of U.S. power in Europe and NATO. And that makes U.S. the most powerful country in Europe, and it's not even a European country. So this suspicion has run a long time. I mean, you could go back to some of the arguments that Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had with Charles de Gaulle, who was the commander of leader of the Free French forces in World War II. President Charles de Gaulle has always been suspicious of the U.S. and U.S. leadership. And that's why he partially withdrew France from NATO in 1966 with the belief that his personal drive, de Gaulle he was very impressed with himself through his personal drive and France being armed with nuclear weapons, he could meet the U.S. and Russia on equal terms in international politics. So he viewed it as the idea that they needed to be separate of U.S. power. And when we go in there, some of the discussions is they are very worried about the presidential election in the U.S., that if Donald Trump becomes president, U.S. will withdraw from NATO. I don't believe that. I don't think that's going to happen. But it's a driver to cause fear, and fear can be used to drive an agenda. So this suspicion of the U.S., both as not being a leader, and the threat that the U.S. is going to leave Europe, is being leveraged by President Macron. So one thing that we look at is where the meat of this proposal is around French nuclear power. That France is the only nuclear power in the European Union. Remember, the U.S. is not in the European Union. The U.K. is not in the European Union. So this makes France the sole nuclear power in the the EU. So France has 290 operational warheads, which is about half of what they had at the height of the Cold War. One thing is that they're operational. This means they are not in storage or anything like that. These are warheads that are ready to go. So they have 290 that are ready to go on a very short notice. They are mainly aboard submarines, and there are also some French soil nuclear capable cruise missiles. The French nuclear weapons is independent of the NATO command structure. So even when France re-entered NATO in 2009 as a full member, it left its nuclear components out of NATO command structure. So this means that the nuclear weapons serve the French vital interest and would never be used for collective security. So the question of vital interest clause has always been ambiguous, but you want that ambiguous. That's what you want in nuclear deterrence. You don't want to telegraph what you're going to do. You don't want to tell them when you're not going to use nuclear weapons. So this is purposely ambiguous. So French presidents have used this vital interest clause in various factors. So President Macron is the same. He is using this vital interest clause, and he added that this vital interest this is in 2020. He said this vital interest clause has a European dimension to it. So this is something that's never been, because French nuclear weapons were for France. Now he's added that the vital interest clause has a European dimension to it. In late April, President Macron changed his position again that he would like to have an open discussion with European leaders using French nuclear weapons as part of a, quote, credible European defense, end quote, against Russia. This is huge. Now you're talking about the fact that the French are offering their nuclear weapons to serve the European leaders, the EU, and they're offering their nuclear weapons, again, not offering them to NATO, to the EU, to be able to provide a credible European defense deterrent against Russia. Remember, European Union doesn't have an army, but he's offering nuclear weapons, French nuclear weapons, to serve the vital interests of France, which includes Europe. So this is a seismic change in nuclear policy for the French. So this means the French nuclear weapons can be used for collective defense and deterrence. But he did add that France would retain control of French nuclear weapons, but that they can contribute to European defense. So again, this is where I feel like it's a power play to put France in the driver's seat of the European Union, because they are offering their weapons, but they will maintain control of the weapons. He's also indicated, and this is another seismic shift, is that he's indicated that he's willing to station French nuclear weapons outside of France, including countries that currently host U.S. nuclear weapons. So this is the first time, again, they've been on submarines or they've been on French territory. Now he's talking about deploying them outside of France. So what he's talking about is using French nuclear weapons to serve the vital interests of France with its European dimension, that these weapons can be used for collective defense in the European Union, and this will make the EU a nuclear power. And he also wants to add some other proposals, that he wants to have a long-range missile capability and missile defense system, very similar to the U.S. But his initial proposal is to make the European Union a nuclear power with the use of French nuclear weapons. So what he's doing here, again, why is he doing this, is he seems like this is the time for the French to do this. And again, France is the only nuclear power in the EU. UK's gone. So this puts the French in a powerful position with its nuclear weapons, and it would have the monopoly in the EU of nuclear weapons. It will retain control of, and it will have the final say on all matters of use and delivery and deterrence of nuclear weapons, because in the end, they are French nuclear weapons that are under the control of France that are being offered to the EU. That means France will set all policy regarding the use of nuclear weapons and their deployment within the EU. Of course, the EU has to accept this, but basically this puts France in the driver's seat of determining nuclear policy in the EU. The second factor, what I discussed earlier, is the fact that the U.S. will leave NATO, and this, the U.S. leaving NATO would give France an opportunity for France to fill the vacuum of a lost American military power. So he's using this fear. Again, I don't see any credible, serious questions that the U.S. is going to leave NATO, but he's using this fear of it, and the Europeans eat this fear up. He's using this fear against European leaders as an attempt to insert France as the leading power on the continent and to give it influence and leadership, and that's one of its long-term goals of creating an EU army. If the U.S. leaves NATO, as he's saying that will happen or could happen, is France is willing to use its nuclear weapons and is willing to use its influence to create an EU army to fill the vacuum of the loss of American military power. Of course, this won't happen overnight, but he's using the conditions on the ground now to try to insert France into a position of becoming the lead military power in the EU. So we'll go into the French proposal itself and say that it does have merit, because outside of the fear mongering of the U.S. leaving and taking advantage of being the sole nuclear power in the EU, is take all that out. The proposal does have merit because the deployment and doctrine around nuclear weapons does have a deterrence effect, and that has been experienced in the Cold War. You didn't have a large land war in Europe during the Cold War because both sides were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. So most agree that the presence of nuclear weapons does have a moderating effect on warfare. So the idea of making the European Union a credible nuclear power that is also a economic superpower would put it at something close, or I want to say close, but closer to a peer, military peer to the Russians. They would have a nuclear deterrence. They have a lot fewer nuclear weapons, but 290 nuclear weapons is nothing to sneeze at. And of course, there will probably be some type of U.S. response if nuclear weapons hopefully never are ever exchanged in Europe. So the French proposal is, again, it's going back to that Cold War logic of balance of terror, the mutually assured destruction of using of threatening nuclear weapons to moderate any future conflict. So this could also be a way to start drawing down the Ukraine war, because the deployment of French nuclear weapons, and Macron has said he's ready to use them when Russia has threatened France and Europe with a nuclear attack. So this French proposal is a European one. It would be independent of NATO and the U.S. And so it is a deterrent that is not conditioned on Article 5 requirements. So the French, even though, again, they're talking about deploying nuclear weapons, this is independent of NATO. So Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all, is not a requirement of this proposal by the French. So it just looks like this is an opportunity for France to leverage the situation on the ground to leverage its long-term goals of creating a European army. What puts France in a good place of this is France did not allow their military power to decay after the Cold War. Yes, they did reduce their armed forces, but they also, like the U.S., they kept their weapons industry going. They continued to make aircraft. They didn't let their armed forces go to complete depletion like Germany. So the French are in a place where they're willing, that they can start stepping up in military matters because they have the greatest military potential, even outside nuclear weapons, in the European Union. So this puts them in a superior military position. And so they could be able to reshape the EU with an armed force that's commensurate with the economic power under French leadership. Again, they can do this all outside of NATO and all within the EU. And so this is not some mad scheme by the French for world domination, but it is an opportunity that has long been a desire of Gallic policies of using the potential power of the EU to get those Gallic policies that have long been desired by the French. So, will this happen? I don't know. I had not seen anything that's saying that the European Union is willing to accept becoming a nuclear power under what the French are saying is their terms. So more to come. Interesting proposal. Again, I think that France is leveraging a crisis to try to insert itself. Macron is in his last term. This is his opportunity to make his last opportunity to make an impression on Europe and make the European Union much more French than it has been. Make it maybe much more French and maybe a little less other countries. So see more to come. That's a big step for the European Union to think about becoming a nuclear power. But there are some serious considerations of the mismatch between Europeans' economic superpower status and its non-existent military stature that is completely reliant on NATO protecting the European Union, which they're not required to do because the European Union is not a Article 5 member. So more to come on it. Interesting conversation. Again, I think it's the Macron trying to make his last chance to make an impression to shape Europe into a French model. So the last paper for the week was an eventful week between China and the Philippines, which you never run out of topics to talk about when it comes to the Chinese and the Philippines. So this week, or last week, there was again another demonstration that the Philippines is not backing down from China's threats. China keeps coming back, insisting, becoming more bellicose. They continue to do provocations against the Filipinos, and the Filipinos respond. They're not backing down, meaning the Filipinos. So this week, or last week's actions, where the previous ones have been focusing on the Second Thomas Shoal and the Sierra Madre, this one was actually in a different location within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, but at the Scarborough Shoal. So in this case, what happened was the Philippine Coast Guard, and I think it was called a fishery agency ship. I think it was originally misidentified as a Coast Guard vessel as well. They went to conduct a patrol into the Scarborough Shoals to provide supplies to Filipino fishermen around the shoal and to provide open the fishery because there has been a presence of the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese Maritime Militia. So the Filipino government sent two government ships to patrol into the economic zone and meet at the second Scarborough Shoals, or the Scarborough Shoals, not the second, the Scarborough Shoals. These Filipino ships were intercepted by 4 Chinese Coast Guard and 6 maritime militia ships. 2 of the Chinese Coast Guard ships used water cannons. This has been a common tactic of the Chinese Coast Guard against the Philippine Coast Guard ship, and they doused it for about an hour. And there's several news cameras. I think they had a drone up showing the entire event. That's intentional. Philippines government has decided that they're going to make these as public events as possible. So there's lots of cameramen, lots of camera angles, lots of reporters to take pictures of this. So there's a lot of pictures going on in this one. And so the attack lasted for over an hour where they were dousing this Chinese Coast Guard ship, which is the first time they've ever used water cannons against a Coast Guard vessel, Philippine Coast Guard vessel. And they doused it for over an hour, and it caused minor damage to the ship, and it didn't cause any injuries. Now, these Chinese Coast Guard ships are more robust than the ships that were sent out, like do the Second Thomas Shoal operation, even though they were run by the naval personnel on these ships. They were using civilian ships to help run supplies, and these ships were damaged by water cannons. But this was a government vessel, much more sturdy, much more significant than a civilian ship. And one thing that's clear is that the Chinese were using higher pressure cannons. So they were delivering more water at a higher pressure and causing more damage to ships than they have before. So a little bit of an escalation coming from the Chinese side as well. And then they also, one of the other Chinese Coast Guard cutters attacked the Philippine fishery ship with a water cannon. Again, no injuries, minor damage to the ships. Now, the Philippines did say that they were able to continue on with the patrol, but I think that's more hearsay, not for any matter of lack of courage. But on the Philippine side, they were just simply outnumbered. There was 10 ships against their 2. And then, of course, there was the Philippine fishing boats there, but they were not involved in the action. So the Philippine ships were able to continue on with their patrol, but they didn't accomplish their mission because the Chinese went in there and installed a 380-meter, 415-yard floating barrier that blocked the lagoon of the shoal, which prevented Philippine fishermen from entering the fishing area. Remember, by international law, the Scarborough Shoal is in the Philippine exclusive economic zone. This is their fishing area. They're allowed to fish in there. And the Chinese had blocked the lagoon to keep Filipino fishermen from entering the area. The Chinese Coast Guard was not able to remove that barrier. They had done it one time before, but they were not able. The Chinese put it back. The ships were not able to take it out this time around. So yes, they were able to continue with their patrol, but they were not able to fully accomplish their mission. Now, unlike the Second Thomas Shoal, which has the rusted out, battered Philippine grounded ship, the Sierra Madre, the Scarborough Shoal has no standing structures at all. So, but it is in the Philippine EEZ, so it's basically just a reef of which a shallow reef for the to fish from. But the Chinese have maintained, since there's no buildings, not like the Sierra Madre where the Philippines can maintain a presence there all the time. You can't do that at the Scarborough Shoal. So what the Philippine or the Chinese Coast Guard has done is and the Maritime Militia have maintained a constant maritime presence since 2012 in the waters in and around the shoal. And this is to keep anybody from settling within there. So they're not building any stuff or any type of structures on the island, but they're not allowing anybody else, and they have maintained a constant presence in that area, in that disputed area. So the Chinese, after this incident, this well-documented incident, the Chinese foreign ministry responded to accuse the Philippines of violating their Chinese sovereign territory, and that they would take whatever action is required to protect their territory, such as using high-pressured water cannons. So, again, this is all part of this legal wrangling between the two countries. The international courts are on the Philippine side. The Chinese side say they have some weird, odd, vague historic claim to the area that only came into effect when they found that there's gas and other natural resources in the South China Sea. But anyway, so they claim some historic claim and reject the international court. So there's wrangling going on in there. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry stated that the previous president, Duarte, I think it's Rodrigo Duarte, had signed a gentleman's agreement that he would not escalate the. Excuse me. So anyway, that they would say that the previous presidents, the Chinese claim that the previous president, Rodrigo Duarte, said that he signed a gentleman's agreement with the Chinese government that they would do no escalatory actions inside the South China Sea. So basically, it was we'll leave the area alone, meaning the Philippines, and the Chinese in their part would not do anything as far as like building structure. So it was basically the gentleman's agreement. It's basically acquiescence to Chinese demands. Just basically it means that the Philippines have to back off, but the Chinese can continue on as they were. Then the Chinese Foreign Ministry said the current government, which is under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., had reached an agreement this month, April, or now it's May, but in April, with China not to escalate tensions based on a common understanding in the region. But they gave no name sources of who signed this, who was involved in these negotiations. They didn't give any agreement. They didn't indicate any of that. Also, in the Philippine government, the administration of President Marcos, is pursuing to see does this gentleman's agreement really exist between the former president and China. And so both these agreements are being used by the foreign ministry as the tacit acknowledgement that the Philippines recognize the Chinese claims in the region. But the China provided no backup. They provided no proof. They just say, hey, there's these agreements. You're breaking the agreement, so you are the aggressor. You escalated this issue. You caused this issue. And also the way the Chinese Foreign Ministry shaped these agreements is they're just saying, oh, no, by you making these agreements, you agree to the Chinese claims in the region. So it's really something that's shaped. So China provides no names. They come up with two agreements that just so happen to meet the Chinese demands, but they provide no proof. And then they turn around, though, they play this to the international press. And then, so the Philippines respond, President Marcos responds saying he denies that any such agreement existed, and they are following up to see if there was any agreements made by the former president. But it doesn't really matter because first off, they have not provided any written documentation. They provided no names except your other president, President Duarte. So there's nothing signed. There's nothing. So it's not binding. So there's nothing here that could sit there and say that even if this occurred, it's not binding because nothing was ever signed. Neither country, obviously the Philippines have denied it. They've not come up with any signed forms. And I think if there was something signed, it would have come forward. So it doesn't matter what China claims. This is all a public relations ploy by China to make Philippines look like the somebody that's not honoring agreements, and they are responsible for escalating tensions. So the Philippine side, as I stated earlier, is they're not backing down. They're still running operations into these areas that are contested. Again, Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal. They've added a lot of media access to it, so there's a lot of documentation of what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea. Lots of pictures, documented evidence, and there are indications, no formal request yet, but it sounds like the Philippines are moving towards submitting documentation and making another claim against China in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas against all these Chinese provocations. It won't make a difference to China. China's going to do what they're going to do. All that they see, they rule in their mind. So, but what it is that the Philippines has provided documentation that the aggressive actions of the Chinese in the disputed regions in the Filipino EEZ are well documented, and these can be shown to the world. And they are showing them to the world. You should go out and see them. I mean, there's nothing graphic about them. It's pretty unreasonable. There are cases also where they use military grade lasers on maritime militia ships to blind Filipino sailors. So lots of documentation worth going and looking at, see what they're doing. Again, none of them are graphic. It just goes to show some of the ridiculousness of what China's doing in the area. One thing that is also escalatory or change of tactics is Filipino Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro, excuse me if I pronounce that wrong, stated that his country will not telegraph its missions in disputed regions going forward. So, not sure how they can do this. There's a lot of Chinese ships out there with the maritime militia, with the Coast Guard, with other assets, but the Philippines said they are not going to telegraph their missions, so that that the Chinese will have less time to react. Might mean they have to keep their ships out there longer and not run them back to refueling operations, back to either back to mainland China or to some of the other islands that China maintains for fueling stations. So it will probably stretch the Chinese Coast Guard and the maritime militia a little bit further. Not sure how they can completely surprise the Chinese in that regard, but they have said they're not going to telegraph their actions like they have in the past. So the only question is, how are the Chinese going to view this? Are they going to view this change in tactics as an escalation? And if it is an escalation, are they going to find some way to counter-escalate that? So more to come and see what that really matters. So far, I have not seen anything showing a change in tactics. Not saying it's not going to happen, but it could. Will just be interesting to see what happens. So all this is happening. The Scarborough Shoal incident is happening while the exercise called Balikatan 2024 continues, which is an annual exercise mainly between the U.S. and the Philippines, but other countries often get involved. This year's primary involvement is France for the first time. So, China calls these this is probably where North Korea gets it. China's called these exercises provocative, and that they're against, just like bringing in foreign elements into disputes in the South China Sea, they are against having exercises with foreign elements, France and the United States, and these types of exercises are, quote, gunboat mentality. So again, the idea of no foreign elements, and they don't want any type of formation of alliances. Certainly do not want the Philippines training with other countries, especially foreign elements. And part of the foreign element is that the United States and the Philippines have a defense agreement, and the U.S. and the Philippines are making it very clear to the Chinese that there is a defense agreement between the two countries. So the Balikatan 2024 exercise is still going on. It will go on till, I think it's got about another week to it. Today, again, is May 4th. I think they run till the 10th. So the previous exercises of Balikatan, this has been predominantly a naval and air exercises. For the most part, the exercises has taken place along the coastal waters of the Philippines. This time around, it is taking place in the Philippine EEZ. Now, it's not taking place at the Scarborough Shoal or the Second Thomas Shoal, but it is taking place in the EEZ, which is in disputed territory to the Chinese. So, again, not internationally, it's not a dispute, but to the Chinese, it is disputed waters. So, they're also introducing new weapons. Both the Philippines, I think the Philippines are going to, for the first time, launch a Harpoon anti-ship missile from a ship. The U.S. is also going to be moving some new weapons systems. The U.S. Army-based missile systems. This is all these missile systems are possible because the U.S. and Russia allowed the intermediate range treaty to expire. So now the U.S. and Russia can start deploying longer range weapons, not necessarily nuclear weapons, but longer range weapons. And the U.S. has, this time around, is deploying weapons into missile systems, not to fire, but practice deploying them in areas that could, in islands that could be conceivably used against China if they invaded Taiwan. So this is where China says that these are provocative and that these actions by the Allies, that they're the ones that are causing the escalations. But these exercises are dictated by China's claims and threats over the South China Sea and Taiwan. The U.S. would not, and France would not, and the Philippines would not be doing any of this as far as deploying missiles into islands south of Taiwan or in the EEZ if China was not being so provocative in these areas. So again, I know it's international, your side never does anything wrong, but it's, again, China is not being, certainly not being an honest evaluator of its own actions, that it is, this action-reaction cycle is, they're threatening to invade Taiwan, so this exercise, the U.S. takes as an opportunity to deploy missiles on what would be a suspected, or areas that would be suspected to help the U.S. counter an invasion of Taiwan. Other thing the Chinese did is they actually spied on the exercise. Now, that's not unusual. The Russian, Soviet times, they did it, we've done it, is we spy on other countries' exercises. And China is no different. So Bellakaton 2024 has the three primary countries involved: U.S., Philippines, and France. But there's also 14 nations that have been invited to observe the exercise. China is not one of those people, but China inserted itself uninvited into the observer nations' locations on the sea. Now, this was obviously a break in protocol. It caused the halt of a live fire exercise that was scheduled for Sunday, April 28th, because they sent two spy ships and a frigate into this area unauthorized, into the where the observing nations were supposed to be. So they interfered with the prearranged location of the exercise, so they had to cancel the live fire exercise. Spy ships are still around, and there has not been any other incidents where they have interfered directly in preventing the exercise to occur. There was no real protests over it. It was blown over pretty quickly, though it was a bold move on the Chinese part to actually interfere with the exercise and insert themselves to the observers. The Chinese also sent we'll call this a research ship, into the Philippine EEZ this week, as well, during the Bellakaton exercise, during the time of the Scarborough Shoals. So a lot of activity going on in South China Sea this week. Again, an adventurous week. This Chinese flagged ship was it stationed itself in the Philippine EEZ, also south of Taiwan. And remember, a lot of the U.S. deployments of missiles from the U.S. Army were also south of Taiwan in the EEZ. So this ship is in this area. Not saying it was necessarily monitoring U.S. activities, but it was in the same vicinity. Again, there was no live fire exercises were scheduled, so it's not like the ship had to move. But anyway, this ship took a stationary position. There was no observed crews on the deck. There was no distress calls made, and the Chinese ship did not answer any contacts from a Philippine Nomad N-22 military aircraft that was sent out to investigate. So, ship sitting there, Chinese flagged, no crew on top, not answering any calls, just sitting there in the waters off of south of Taiwan in the EEZ of the Philippines. So the Philippines went ahead and dispatched a ship to the area to shadow the Chinese ship. And though it's unclear the purpose, it is assumed that it's collecting data on possible invasions of Taiwan, maybe monitoring air traffic reactions, because again, the Chinese were also conducting air exercises around Taiwan. It could have been monitoring the U.S. activities on the islands south of Taiwan as well. So obviously not a research ship, unsure what it is, but again, it inserted itself very closely to the Balikatan exercises, though it didn't interfere with the exercises itself, except for the Philippines did have to send resources out to monitor that ship. So obviously the Chinese are becoming more and aggressive and bellicose towards the Philippines, both using water cannons, to substantiated agreements, portray the Philippines as the aggressor, but can't provide any proof that these agreements actually occurred. They obviously they're not binding because nothing can be proved, because nothing has been signed. But it's just another area of gray tactics. So this is what things that, and then China inserting themselves into the Balikatan exercise, either directly or indirectly. And then the Philippines, for their part, are not backing down either. So they're going in there, and so they're not stopping running their making runs to the shoal, in the second Scarborough Shoal or the Scarborough Shoal and the second Thomas Shoal. They're continuing to go to those regions. They are ignoring China's demands not to bring foreign elements, because again, the exercise that's going on now has 2 foreign elements in it. They are conducting exercises, and they're having also a separate exercise with France outside of Balikatan exercise. France and Japan are both expected to sign defense agreements with the Philippines this month as well. The Teodoro has signaled that Philippines will change their tactics and make it harder for them to predict, and that the Philippines' continued challenges to China in the EEZ is a matter of national pride. So you can see that both countries are this week have done things that irritate the other. So again, you're in this action-reaction cycle. So this concerns coming as, hey, China this week made these they've made these claims. I claim they're false. I think most people agree they're false. Most analysis. The Philippines are doing activities that irritate China. Just when China says don't do this, the Philippines do it. So they're irritating the Chinese. So there's concern that this action-reaction cycle that we're seeing now, these water cannons also used at higher pressure rates. So there is concern and analysis that this is going to be the next flashpoint of war in the Pacific. And I think this is really highly unlikely because, and I've discussed this before, is a war with the Philippines is the wrong war for China. China has obviously a capable military. They've got the largest navy in the world. Is it the most capable? No, but it is the largest, has a lot of ships. There's certainly nothing to ignore. But the first off is China's aircraft, or their aircraft, their main source of power to project into the region is its Air Force. Obviously, you don't want ships operating without air cover. Well, the air cover, the mainland-based air cover, is out for China. It can't reach to the Philippines. So that means that any war with the Philippines would be outside of mainland China air cover. So does that mean that China would be willing to deploy its fleet around the Philippines and into the teeth of the U.S. Navy? Doesn't seem possible. It doesn't make any strategic sense to do that. So that's where my belief is the position of the Chinese Air Force being too far out. A carrier, the Chinese do not have I would say a fully operational aircraft carrier fleet, so it can't project power outside of its, so if it wants air cover over its fleet that's projecting power, it has to do so with aircraft carriers. It does not have a working fleet of aircraft carriers that could challenge the U.S. Navy. They do have two, but they are of similar Russian designs of the Kuznetsov and an improved version of the Kuznetsov, which again are not very good aircraft carriers. Certainly not a challenge to the U.S. Navy. They do have their third aircraft carrier, which is much more capable on paper, and it just started sea trials this week. So they only have two aircraft carriers, so they can't project air power all the way out to the Philippines. So it's the wrong war. They cannot project power. Okay, obviously they have missiles, but for the most part, trying to negate the Philippines, operate on the east side of the Philippines is just not going to be possible. Also, replenishment of projecting their navy without air cover into Philippine waters, into the West Philippine Sea, or to the east of the Philippines, into the teeth of the U.S. Navy and probably the Japanese Navy. It's not going to work into the Chinese favor. The Chinese primary goal right now, it appears to be, is the eventual quote reunification of Taiwan. If they go into a war with the Philippines and the U.S. would be involved there, I'm not saying who's going to win or lose, but the Chinese fleet will be guaranteed to be mauled by the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy, and also other countries involved, Philippines. They would be mauled to the point that they could not carry out the invasion of Taiwan. So if they press all the disadvantages of fighting a war against the Philippines, they are basically indefinitely postponing any chance to reunite with Taiwan. So it's the wrong war. They would also, to fight this wrong war, they would have to give up what appears to be their primary goal of reunifying with Taiwan. So again, this is just the wrong war for them. And the Philippines know this. And obviously the Philippines are getting advice from the U.S., but the Philippines know this. They're well aware that the projection issues of the Chinese Navy, they know that they don't have air cover, they know they don't have a working aircraft carrier fleet. They know that they would be projecting force in a distance that they've never done before, with the Philippines and its allies having a shorter supply line. So they would have the interior lines compared to the Chinese. So all the disadvantages. And the Philippines know this. So the Philippines know that they can continue to escalate the position because there's only so far China is willing to go in in the war, or risking war. So the Philippines can know that the chances of this turning into a war are pretty remote. So there's more upside to the Philippine side and less so on the Chinese side. Not saying that they won't have this counterpoint, but this will only go so far. And at some point it's going to become a distraction to the Chinese. Not saying that they'll give up their claims, but they will probably get to the point that they will stop escalating the tactics. And if that happens, most likely the Philippines will stop escalating tactics as well. Not saying there will be a peace treaty involved, but if the Philippines stick to the plan, they stick to their advantages, they know that they have the backing of the U.S., in the end, the Philippines hold the upper hand. China knows that as well. So I don't see this turning into a flashpoint for war. I could always be wrong. All it takes is one errant commander to make a bad decision and things go south. But in when you review it, this is the wrong war for China. Philippines know that. That means Philippines have the upper hand. But this is all out the window until China has a larger and credible aircraft carrier and that they can actually project power with an effective aircraft carrier force. Or they break out of the first island chain. For example, they invade Taiwan and now they can go after other, they can move land-based aircraft to Taiwan, and that all of a sudden extends their power deeper into the South China Sea, probably even cover into parts of the Philippines itself, or at least the northern islands of the Philippines. So all that's off the board yet. So it kind of goes into this fact is the Taiwan is the linchpin. Is if the Philippines or if Taiwan, if China decides that it's going to invade or attack the Philippines, it is giving up Taiwan because of the damage the casualties it will take to its fleet will negate any chance of having an effective invasion of Taiwan. But if they invade Taiwan first and they're successful there, then that opens up the wider parts of the South China Sea to China and puts other countries in danger. So the linchpin is Taiwan and not the Philippines. And the Philippines know that. Again, that's just my opinion. More to come on that. All it takes is war's a tricky thing, and all it takes is, again, one errant commander to make a bad move, and all my predictions are out the window. But that's my story right now, and that's what I'm sticking to. If you have any other thoughts on it, I would be more than happy to hear about them. I'm a one-man show, so often it helps to hear from somebody else on subjects matters, get a opposing or a different point of view. Always willing to discuss with anybody on that. Of course, always respectfully. So also this week, I want to thank everybody that read my papers, listened to my videos, or watched my videos, but you can also listen to my videos. Just let you know that every I'm a writer, so every paper comes out first on Substack, and then I do a video summary of the paper, which is basically the first paragraph of the paper, which is about a 1-minute video. Goes on YouTube Short, goes on Substack, just so you can kind of hear what this is the topic of the day. Takes a 1-minute listen. You can make a determination if you want to read the paper. That's what my thought is. It at least gives an idea. So you can, instead of committing to read the paper, you can at least hear what it's about, make a decision on your own to read it. And then I write a script to do a video summary that I post on Substack, YouTube, and Rumble. Still up in the air whether I'm going to keep that format, but I'll keep it going for the time being. It actually is the most popular form of videos that I have. Those short videos, they're about 3 to 3.5 minutes a piece. Seem to do fairly well. I think I have 18,000 views on YouTube, not setting the world on fire, but it's a start. I have 1,700 downloads of my audios of my video, the audio files of my videos, and also the other items that I post, because what I've been doing as well is the next day I do an audio version of my paper, which is just me reading my paper out. So all those people that would have to drive in traffic like I have to, is you have an opportunity to listen if you can't read my papers. So I do that of every paper. So you get the printed version, comes out first, and then there will be a video summary and a audio sample, and then the next day there will be an audio version. And then something I started this week is I started doing a longer format video that basically incorporates the entire paper, and those are 6 to 8 minute long videos that are basically everything in my paper with accompanying videos, and those are also on Substack, on YouTube and Rumble. My audio files are on Substack, on Apple Podcast, and on Spotify. So try to spread it out. So all the different versions of how you can hear my work. So still undetermined if I'm going to keep all those files going. I just want to see what hits the audience and what people want to hear, how they want to consume my content. It might be a case where everybody has a little bit different view of what they want to hear. So and I might end up keeping those going. But if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be glad to hear that as well. And I think I added a new country to my list of podcasts. I think it was... no, I don't know. I don't remember who it was, but I added another country. So I'm at 30 countries so far that have listened to my podcast. So that's actually kind of exciting. Last week was my biggest week as far as number of readers to Substack. This week, I don't know if I will beat it. I had 2 records in a row. I don't know if I will make it to a third. I have to have about 80 views in the next, call it 27 hours. So that's probably a tall order, but we'll see. So anyway, I will leave a description of where you can reach me. If you want to support my work, please consider becoming a member. If you're not a member and you just drop in every so often to listen, I do appreciate that as well. But please consider becoming a member, even an unpaid subscriber to Substack. All this helps me spread the word. It helps me with algorithms, helps me get my work out there. I do say that my papers that I write are about 1,500 words. I try to do multi-causal views of things to get you a sample of what's often driving decisions. Not try to give the simple answer, but try to give a multi-cause reason for it. So oftentimes I cannot go into detail, but it's kind of help people kind of know what's going on in the world and don't take the first take when you see something that happens. So anyway, thank you again. I will join you next week. I might even come up with different ways of making this media reach all of my audience. And again, you can contact me on Substack if you have any questions or would like to just discuss anything. So all of you have a good night and a great week, and we will talk to you next week. Bye.